as Hannah asks you questions, I'll just take a couple shots as you go.
Okay.
So don't mind me as a...
Okay, so you're the one who's tripping the strobe?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's the clicker here?
Yes.
Can you hear?
We probably will, yeah.
Do you mind if I close this?
What?
The door? Do you mind if I close this?
No, go ahead. What, the noise from the street?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be welcome.
Well, that should sound a lot of noise. Or just have sensitive ears. Tell me when you're ready.
That light's noisy too.
Well, let me restart it.
Be careful, you'll end up on our wall.
Okay, so Irene, can you tell us your full name, the name you were born with, and then your name now?
I was born as Ruth Rinde, and now I go by Irene Skolnick.
How do you spell that last name?
You mean my maiden name?
Yeah,
R-I-N-D-E.
that's easier than I thought. Okay, and when and where were you born?
I was born on August 22nd, 1937, in the unpronounceable city of Przemyśl in southeastern Poland.
Do you know, how do you spell that?
P-R-Z-E-M-Y-S-L. I know, Americans look at it, and my husband called it pretzel.
It is kind of like pretzel. So how old does that make you right now?
78.
Second youngest in the group.
Oh, wow, all right.
And what is your religious identity?
Jewish.
And Irene, how many siblings do you have?
2. I have an older brother and a younger brother.
Okay. Now, this is the part of the interview where you're just going to tell us your story,
Okay?
your personal Holocaust story. If you want to take breaks, that's fine, because that gives Ryan a chance to snap some more photos. But tell us whatever you want, how much you don't want.
You're not going to be asking questions, you just want me to tell you the
So
story.
I asked them kind of, once I get the whole story, I'll ask you about certain details that come later, but I like to get the whole thing first and then kind of...
All right, why don't I sort of give it to you in broad outline?
That'd be perfect.
And then if you want to zero in on details at certain areas, you know, we can
Yeah.
do, otherwise it will be forever. All right?
I know,
Yeah.
I know.
All right, so I was born in Przemyśl, my father's hometown. My father came from a Orthodox family. He was the youngest of 7. There were 2 things important about that. One is that my grandfather was a very successful entrepreneur. We were one of the wealthiest families in town. The family owned a factory and a general merchandise store. My father managed the store. The importance of Przemyśl is that you may remember, or may not remember, that about 2 weeks before Hitler attacked Poland, he signed a secret non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to protect his Eastern Front. That once he conquered Poland, he would share it with the Soviet Union. And the partition went right through my hometown, putting us on the Soviet side. That was a blessing and a curse. Because under the Soviets, being a capitalist was almost as bad as being Jewish under the Nazis. Because what the Russians said, because you were once in the class of oppressors, you weren't worthy to join the ranks of the workers. And so my father couldn't get any employment. Not only all our possessions were confiscated, whatever couldn't be hidden, but he couldn't earn a living. And he wasn't entitled to food coupons. So gradually everybody moved deeper into the Soviet Union, to a city that I call Lvov by its Polish name. Most people know it better as Lemberg, the German name, or the current Ukrainian name of Lviv. It was a bit bigger city, so my father had a much better chance of hiding his criminal past, as he called it. Yeah. And so we lived under Soviet occupation until June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler broke his agreement with Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union, and within days we came under Nazi occupation. See, and that's when life changed drastically. I can go into details as to, what happened and so forth, but all the discriminatory laws that were promulgated really reduced Jews to second-class citizens at best. There was daily humiliation, constant uncertainty as to your life. And as rumors started filtering in as to what befell the people who were deported, allegedly it was for labor, it was relocation, but the horrors of what was actually happening started filtering in, and they were so horrible that nobody believed, except for my mother. My mother was a very suspicious woman, and anything bad she believed. And so there was one incident in particular that occurred in October 41. The order came out that Jews had to wear a white armband with a blue Magen David on it on the left arm. Contrary to the rest of Europe, you all have heard about the yellow star on your chest. Not in Poland. In Poland it was the armband, and only for people 12 years and older. So I was exempt, as was my brother. But one of my father's sisters didn't feel she needed to wear it. She was stopped by a Ukrainian militia young man who checked her papers, who obviously revealed she was Jewish, asked for a bribe, trivial bribe, which she would not pay. So he took her to the Germans. She was imprisoned for a month, during which time the family tried to buy her freedom unsuccessfully. At the end of the month, all the prisoners were trucked to a forest and executed. The reason that was so important, well, two reasons that was so important. One is to really send the message to the family that the Germans meant what they said. But also, when the family tried to buy her freedom, they were offering dollars. Dollars were forbidden to be owned by civilians, by anybody, certainly not by Jews. And so one morning, my father was at work, my brother and I must have been in school somewhere. My mother was lingering in bed, and two Gestapo guys showed up searching for dollars. And they started searching throughout the room. And when one of them was looking at some albums, another one picked up my mother's purse and started looking through it. And that was one place which my mother had hidden dollars. And trying to distract him, she started talking to the one looking at the albums, trying to get him interested. Oh, have you been there? This and they got angry at her. They said, "You were told to sit. Take off your nightgown and sit down." And so my mother takes off her nightgown, goes back and sits down at the edge of the bed. But the man searching through her purse got distracted, threw it aside, and that danger passed. Few minutes later, the second man went to her dressing table, and that was another place where she had dollars. Now, the older people watching this may remember the days when women used face powder. And the face powder came in a round, tall container with a deep cover. The cover went the whole depth of the box, because inside the cover was the puff, the powder puff. And my mother had put the dollars between the inside cover and the puff. So when that German started rummaging through her cosmetics, she got very nervous. Naked as she was, she got up and said, and these are my cosmetics, and this is my rouge, and this is my this, and this is my powder. And she opened the box, holding the puff with her thumb so that it wouldn't fall out, revealing the dollars, and then quickly closed it. Now they got really angry at her. She got pulled out, told to go back, sit down, and not to budge again, or else. Well, there was no need to budge again. They finished searching, didn't find anything, and left. But this humiliating experience was at the root of my mother's decision that she was not going to stay in the ghetto. Because the next month we were herded into the ghetto. Life got much more difficult and challenging. And sometimes in the spring of 1942 was when my mother came to the decision that surviving in the ghetto was not an option, and she wasn't going to stay and put up with the daily humiliations and uncertainty of life. She was going to obtain false papers and pass herself off as a Catholic. We call that, going Aryan, right? Pretending to be an Aryan. Everybody in the family thought my mother was crazy. My father didn't think she was crazy, but my father said, look, I can't deny my Judaism. It's not in me. I can't do it, but I won't stand in your way if you want to do that. And you can do it with both children or with one of the children, but I cannot do that. The chauffeur that was employed in my grandfather's factory was on very good terms with my parents, and it was he and his wife who offered to sell their birth certificates to my parents. My father refused, my mother accepted, and no sooner she got it that she went to a counterfeiter she knew of and had him do three things. Modify her Polish papers to match the new name, create a fake German ID, because they had issued their own IDs, and she asked him to make a birth certificate for my father without telling my father about it. Now, in the early days of August of 1942, there was a massive deportation in my home city, in Przemyśl. My grandparents took cyanide pills to be spared the deportation. That was the most expensive item on the black market in those days. When my father learned that news, he changed his mind and he told my mother, I'm going with you. And so to leave, my parents sort of sensed that time was getting very, very tight. A lot of cities approaching Lviv were undergoing deportations. And so they first decided to get the kids out. From the Russian days, my father had become good friends with the principal of a women's business school where he worked, and had maintained the friendship, so that at this point he asked if she would take the children, to get the children out of the ghetto first, and then the next day they would leave. She agreed to take my brother. She was single, she was gone all day to work, and said, I cannot trust two children to be quiet while I'm at work so neighbors don't suspect that there are children here. And therefore she said she would take the older. One of the teachers of the school offered to take me. She had a girl my age and says, oh, she can come, she'll play with my daughter, she'll be a companion. And so the next day, now I'm 5 years old at this point, my brother is 7.5, and we are told by our parents what our new names are. Forget what your names are. This is now what you are called. Forget everything about the past. You don't know where you came from, where we lived before the war, what your father did before the war. And my brother, particularly under strict orders, never to take his pants off in front of anyone, because in Poland only Jews were circumcised. And so for boys it was particularly challenging to try to pass off for a non-Jew. Everything went well, except that in the later that afternoon, as I played with my friend, a Ukrainian boy from the neighborhood recognized me from the Russian days. So we had visited this teacher.
Can you pause there?
Sure.
Okay.
And so this Ukrainian boy's parents told the teacher, you are sheltering a Jewish child. If you don't get rid of her, we'll report you to the Gestapo. And so the next morning, my parents wake up, and it was their plan to leave the ghetto. That was the day the deportation started. The ghetto was surrounded by the SS and the Gestapo, and I can give you the details of how my mother sneaked out to get the papers from the counterfeiter, who then brought my father his papers, and they left the ghetto. Now, in the meantime, the teacher takes me back to the principal's home, telling her about her dilemma, and the principal will not change her position. She said, I cannot risk having two children. Take her back to her parents. And so the teacher brings me back to the ghetto when my parents are gone, and the roundups are beginning for the deportation. It was my luck that the apartment that we shared, because everybody had to share an apartment, was shared with a childless couple, where the husband was a physician. And as a physician, he was, at that time, exempted from roundups. And he took me as his daughter. And we were taken to, actually driven in great elegance, to the hospital, where I spent the night. Now, if you want, I can go into details about this whole ordeal. Just try not to make it all that long. But the next day, I was reunited with my parents. We hid for 2 weeks that the deportation lasted. And when the deportation ended, now was the question, where do we go, how do we go? It was dangerous for Jews to go out on their own, even with fake papers, because under the Nazis, Jews were banned from using public transportation. And so, as such, my parents did not know what changes were introduced, let's say, at the railroad station and so forth. And so, and still feeling a little uncertain in their identity, they wanted the protection of a Christian, of a Pole, to shepherd them out. One of my aunts had made contact with one. She wasn't quite sure about him. He looked shabby, shabbily dressed, was inebriated half the time. My mother went to speak to him at some length and says, okay, we're going with him. We're going tonight. She gave him a down payment, and he said he would take us to Lublin, where he was, pretended to have contacts who would help my father get settled. Now, one good thing about having this Pole front for us is that he knew what route to take. If you travel by major rail lines, there was a high probability of paper inspection. But if you took the milk train, the little side trips, the probability of checks was very slight. And so it took us a long time, but in the morning we arrived in Lublin. Now, several things about Lublin. Number one, the Pole had no contacts. He knew no one. Number two, Lublin was the site of Majdanek, the second largest concentration and extermination camp in Poland. And number three, for historical reasons, the Germans decided to make it a Germanized city. And everything was controlled by the German authorities. You could not stay in a hotel without permission from the German authority. You couldn't do anything. So that was the first dilemma. My father, who was less brazen than my mother, was a phenomenal negotiator with incredible people skills. And what he noticed was an ad in the newspaper of looking for people to enroll in a bookkeeping school. Why? Because after the Germans got rid of all their Jews and most of their Poles, they didn't have enough employees. And the bookkeeping was something that was mainly in the hands of Jews. So they started the school to train new bookkeepers. So my father enrolled in that school, and that gave him a legitimate reason to stay in Lublin. It also gave him his first official, real, authentic piece of ID, of document. And he kind of built on that. And, I can't go into details about, how things led to another. He ended up getting permission to move into a refurbished apartment in the former ghetto. Because when, after all the Jews were deported, they started tearing the ghetto down, and then the Germans realized that, hey, they could move the Poles into those dreary locations, and they could move into the nice apartments owned by the Poles. And so that's where we moved in. And okay, I need to sort of take a pause here to explain. No, I'm not, because I sort of told Hannah before how several years ago someone made the comment when she learned that we survived posing as Christians, saying, oh, what a clever idea. Why didn't everybody do that? And Hannah kind of smirked, having been to Eastern Europe, she understood. I talk in terms of 4 basic essential requirements to be successful. First of all, you couldn't look like a Jew. Now, in America, people don't really understand what it means looking like a Jew. Hannah understood that when she was in Eastern Europe. They look at you and they know. They know whether you're Jewish or not. Jews tended to be having darker complexion, darker hair, brown eyes, and of course the Semitic nose, right? My mother was a perfect picture of an Aryan. She was blonde with blue eyes, high cheekbones, light complexion. Nobody ever suspected my mother of being Jewish. The rest of us were okay. The next thing would be language. you had to speak a perfect, unaccented Polish. Jews, again, in general, Yiddish was their primary language. Jews tended to live apart from the Poles. There were villages that were predominantly Jewish. The city where we lived, I think, if I remember correctly, 1/3 was Jewish. And for instance, in my father's home, language of the home was Yiddish. But for some reason, I never thought of asking my father why all their children were sent to Polish public schools. Because usually that was not the case, especially among the Orthodox. They went to Jewish schools where Yiddish was the language of instruction. So my mother came from a very reformed home. She spoke no Yiddish. Polish was the language of her home, so naturally she went to Polish schools. So when it came to language, we were set. Number 3, if you're going to pretend to be Catholic, you should know something about Catholicism. Well, again, certainly if you're an Orthodox Jew, you don't practice Catholicism. If you live apart from the Catholics, you don't have much opportunity to learn about Catholicism. So this is what always makes some people smirk, because this Orthodox grandfather of mine, in this general merchandise store that he owned, which my father managed, major merchandise was Catholic religious items. Rosaries, crosses, medallions, pictures of the saints, which Catholics used to mark pages in their praying books. And my father's a good businessman. He knew all of that. He was familiar with his merchandise. And his customers not only were the Catholics of the town, but the priests. And in Poland, and I'm told to this day, there is a greeting formula that is used among Christians. And if Jews watch this, they would understand that among Orthodox Jews, if you ask, how are you, you only get one answer. And that's Baruch Hashem, blessed be the name. You never get, I'm fine, it's Baruch Hashem. Well, the same thing in Poland holds true for Catholics. And because my father heard the interaction among the priests and the Christians, he knew that formula. Now the same thing really held true for my mother. Before she got married, she worked in her parents' store. It was a fabric store where they sold high-end fabrics. And so again, many of the customers were the Catholics of the town and were nuns. Nuns in those days did a lot of sewing and embroidery, and so they were patrons. And so again, my mother was exposed to all this interaction and way of speaking. And the fourth and final item, the absolute necessity of being constantly alert and aware of your surroundings, and ability to think on your feet, to respond appropriately to an unexpected event, comment, what have you. And then I like to say, all of this would be no use if you weren't lucky. And it was unbelievable how lucky we were. So we moved into this apartment, a former ghetto, and right off the bat, I was put to the test. There was another family that had moved in there who had a little girl my age, and I went over to her apartment to play because she had toys and I didn't. And her mother started asking me questions. Where do you come from? Where did you used to live? What did your father used to do? And I just clamped up. I just got incredibly interested in the toys I was playing with, and even more so when she repeated the question, and then she got tired and gave up. Um, and you know, there was a whole series of situations where this last item that I talked about of being able to think on your feet, it was just so essential. My father did not have the German ID. There wasn't time to make one for him before we left Lviv. And in Lublin, my parents had no contact to a counterfeiter. So my mother traveled to Warsaw, where she had a friend who was going to introduce her to a counterfeiter. And as they were walking the street, they got stopped by a Polish policeman who asked to see their papers, and her friend pulled out his German ID, and the policeman says, "Ha, and how much did that cost you?" And he quotes the exact price that a counterfeiter charges for fake ID. And so my mother understood she better not produce hers, which was identical, so she produced her Polish ID. And the policeman got angry at her, says, "What are you giving me this? The Germans have been here so long ago, you know, what's your German ID?" And she says, "Well, I come from the East. They haven't been there that long, and they just didn't get around to giving all of us their ID." So he pocketed her ID and his ID and says, "Well, I think you better come with us, with me." And her friend tried to argue. She said, "No, it's okay, come on, let's go, you know, he's the authority." But after a while she sort of asked, I said, "Actually, where are you taking us and why?" And he says, "Well, I'm taking you to the police station because I think you are Jewish." Whereupon my mother burst out laughing, and in an Academy-winning performance, exclaims, "Now that is a good joke. Wait till I get home and tell my friends the adventures that befell me when I visited the nation's capital." And she was so convincing that she threw the policeman off track. He started doubting himself. He gave them back their papers. So telling my mother, "You're okay, but you look like a Bedouin," to her friend. And he let them go. You know, I mean, I can just go through a series of situations where this kind of behavior was absolutely key to circumstances that you just could not predict. When my father got his bookkeeper's degree certificate, started looking for a job. There was a job advertised for a German-speaking person capable to carry on correspondence in the German language. Well, my father was fluent in German. So he applied for the job and he was hired. This was a company making bouillon cubes, which was considered food, and as such under the control of the German authorities, who provided the raw material and then received the finished product. The company was owned by two Polish brothers who didn't speak a word of German. And so they were very happy to hire my father. My father was delighted to get such a job. And he sort of sensed that these were decent people, and that doesn't begin to describe how phenomenal they were. Not only my father's fluency in German was helpful, but also the fact that he was such a fantastic negotiator and people's person. He was able to successfully advocate for employees of the company when they received orders from the Germans to leave the city because they just wanted to get rid of Poles. And one such event occurred very soon after my father started working. was a young man, had appealed. He went there with a friend who was speaking German, and all his appeals were denied. When my father came to work, he asked, would my father go with him? And my father's boss said, look, I know there's nothing you can do. I mean, this is hopeless, but we have to show that management cares. Why don't you go with him? So, new on the job, my father goes to the Gestapo. And as soon as he appears there, the man at the desk says, there's nothing to talk here. He was here the other day and the case is closed. And my father said, but he doesn't speak German. He was here with a friend who spoke German. There's nothing more to discuss. My father said, yeah, but his friend was speaking for him. I speak for the company. He's a key employee. We work for the government. If I have to lose him, we'll have to shut down part of my production. We'll be late in delivering the goods that the government expects. In such a case, all right. He may stay, his family has to leave. So everybody was happy and relieved because it meant also he did not have to vacate his apartment. So this is just sort of one example of a series of favors that my father was able to do for his, for the employees of the company. Now, in the meantime, we sort of got into a little bit of trouble because a brother of my father's and his wife, who had remained in the ghetto in Przemyśl, felt that their security was coming to an end. I mean, they could see their handwriting on the wall. They had placed their daughters into a convent where they bribed the Mother Superior, who was willing to take them. And having nowhere to go, they came to us, into this little tiny apartment in this building with a lot of other tenants. And my parents had to take them in. They couldn't say no. But it was becoming very dangerous. So here again, my father was successful in getting permission from the Germans to move into a vacant single-family home. It was a detached home on the outskirts of the city, quite close to the factory, actually, which was convenient from that point of view. It had a large kitchen and a large bedroom, a cellar, and an attic. No electricity, no indoor plumbing, but it was a detached home. And the cellar and the attic provided very convenient places for people to hide and stay out of sight. So he got permission for us to move there. And so things were sort of settled for a while. Do you want to ask me questions, or you want me to continue with the various episodes?
Do you need anything?
And I ended up telling the whole story.
So that place that you're describing now was the place that you guys stayed for a while, right?
Yeah, that's where we stayed until the liberation.
Okay, if you could just tell us about that a little bit, that would be good. About that house, and because I don't know if you had to stay in there. Did you ever go out again past a certain date? Did you guys stay in there all the time, day and night, or did you leave?
I'm not sure I understand. What do you mean stay?
Like, did you stay in the house, or were you guys able to go outside still?
We lived there.
Yeah.
My father went to work. I mean, my brother went to school. I played with the kids in the neighborhood. The ones who had to stay were the ones that were hidden.
Yeah.
My aunt and uncle, and then eventually their daughters lost their cover in the convent, and so they came. And whenever members of the family sort of lost their safe place, they knew they could come to us to catch their breath, to relocate, and to go on. So we were sort of the safe house for a number of members of the family.
So what was the maximum amount of people that were there at one time that
12.
you can remember?
12.
And how many of those people had to remain hidden?
8.
Whoa.
There were only 4 of us that were legal.
Yeah. And how close were you guys?
And just think about this, no indoor plumbing.
I can't think about that actually. And how close were you guys to Majdanek exactly?
About half a mile.
That's crazy. So 12 people. And these were all your family members?
Yes. Yeah, I know, it's difficult. It's difficult to picture.
You guys spend in that house?
We moved to that house around January 43, and we stayed there until July 44, when the Red Army liberated us.
So your entire immediate family survived?
Yes. Well, my father lost 2 siblings. The sister who was shot, and actually the one who should have been the safest. His oldest brother was a physician, and so he had this special exemption thing. The trouble was that he was the only radiologist in Przemyśl, and Jews were not allowed to have Christian patients.
Right.
And a Christian woman once came to him begging that he take an x-ray. This was reported, and he, his wife and daughter were ordered to report to the deportation place. And he actually sounded the alarm to the family. If an alarm needed to be sounded, he managed to send a postcard back home saying, depending on who tells the story, my mother said, do what you must, but don't get deported. Other members say, the postcard said, go where Oscar went, don't go where I went. Now, Oscar was one of the brothers who happened to have been in France when the war broke out. He was recently married, so his bride was with him. And he was smart enough not to return to Poland, but to stay in France, and made his way to the United States during the war, which we all knew. So when my father's oldest brother said, go where Oscar went, don't go where I went, it was quite clear, to the family, don't get deported.
So let me see. Is there anything else that you want to tell us from that period of time that's important to you?
Well, what is important is the ingenuity of really every member of the family at any given time to behave appropriately to a given situation. You know, when my brother, now you have to think about how old we are, right? So my brother is about 9 years old. Not even, because he was 7.5, so it was probably 8, maybe 8.5. Is out playing with his buddies on a hot summer day, and the oldest decide to go swimming. Yeah? And nobody had bathing suits in those days, right? So you strip and you go swimming. And he knows he can't do that. So he pretends that he's very clumsy, he suddenly slips, he trips, falls in the water fully dressed, and says, well, as long as I'm wet, I might as well stay. Well, you did not do that during the war when clothing was scarce and expensive. And so they said, oh, we're going to tell on you, wait till your mother hears about this. So, of course, in front of all his buddies, she has to scold him, and she hits him, for how dare you do this, and then behind closed doors, hugs him and kisses him and commends him for his quick thinking. So, for kids, it was really challenging of playing this role. You are one person when you're outside in the world, and you're somebody else behind doors. And when I was raising my children, I was thinking, could they do that? Would they know how to knock on the door to indicate whether they're alone or whether they're accompanied with somebody? Because after a while, the hidden people started resenting having to stay out of sight.
Mm-hmm.
And they've found all kinds of reasons to be downstairs. And that presented a problem. If you come, so first of all, it meant that you really didn't bring anybody home, which in itself was kind of suspicious. I would go to my friend's house to play. I would not bring them over to my house to play because that was too dangerous. My father had to travel for business, and so once he had to go to Krakow with his boss at a time when there were rumors that there were sudden roundups on the street. It wasn't just for Jews, but they had run out of Jews by then. Now they were getting rid of Poles because 3 million Poles died from the Nazis. So, they weren't smart enough that we weren't the only ones that were in danger, that so were they. But, and when they finished their business and were ready to go home, my father sort of had second thoughts and says, why don't I perhaps get a certificate to the fact that we attended this official German conference? And his boss laughed at him, says, oh, come on, you're always right. But it makes you feel happy, go ahead. Well, they took the train, and they were almost in Lublin when the train stops. So the station is surrounded by the SS, everybody off the train, and registration for Majdanek. So my father pulls out his certificate, he goes to the head honcho there and presents it and explains, and so man reads it and said, well, why don't you use this exit, which was the exit for the army. The man who was dispatched from the factory to pick them up said they were the only two people who came out of this railroad station. So, it was luck, it was anticipation, it was being super careful. The fact that my father was so fluent in German twice almost tripped him up. The factory was working on 3 shifts, and so therefore it was using up a lot of electricity, which is always scarce during the war. So the director of the electric company came to investigate, why does this company need so much electricity? Of course, he was German. So my father takes him around and shows him and explains and blah, blah, blah. And halfway through that, the man stops him and says, how come you speak German so well? Poles, more like Americans, spoke Polish and nothing else, not known to be linguists. The Jews were the linguists. And so for a moment, my father really was kind of stumped for that. But knowing history, he said, well, I come from this town in the west, the western part of Poland that sort of kept flipping sides back and forth between Germany and Poland, and people from there tended to speak both languages. But as the devil who had it, that's where this man was from. Says, oh, really? Oh, there's a whole group of us from there. Do you know this one? Do you know that one? Of course, my father didn't know any of them. So he says, well, really, I am from this little town next to it. And it happened, my mother's cousin had a business there, and so he mentions the business, and they used to work there. Well, he wasn't familiar with that. He let it pass. Another time, my father was in a tavern with his boss, drinking. And there was a commander from Majdanek, joined them and started yapping away. So, of course, my father does the translation. And partly through the conversation, the German asks him, "Wow, how come you speak German so well?" At which point my father decided that over a drink he could push back, and he said, "What's the matter? You think only Germans can speak German? You have a problem with the Poles speaking German? We can speak German too." And he was just so aggressive about that he accepted, pulled back, and let it go. One day, a Jew escaped from Maidan. And the address he gave was our address. And so in the morning, my father was due back from a trip. It was a dangerous trip that he had to make, and everybody was very nervous. And we were waiting anxiously for his return, which gave the excuse for all the hidden people to stay downstairs. This was in the morning. And as the tension was rising, my mother asked my brother to go and look to see if he could see my father coming. But the street we lived in was a very long street, and you could see quite a bit into the distance. And as my brother opened the door, he sees a truck with Germans. Just stopped, and they're coming out. And he has the presence of mind to quickly close the door and sound the alarm. Germans are here. And the cavalcade starts running up the ladder into the attic. Well, the plan had always been, in such a situation, that the last person up would pull the ladder up into the attic, close the trap door, and my uncle devised some closing mechanism that you couldn't push that trap door open from inside. There wasn't time. My uncle was still on the rung of the ladder when the Germans started pounding on the door. So to cover the noise of my uncle climbing up, my mother sort of raises her voice, "Who's pounding on the door? Where's the fire?" So the Germans answer, "Oh, police!" Well, give time my uncle to get into the attic. No time to pull up the ladder. Just closes the trap door. Since my mother had already opened the door, he didn't dare to do whatever that closing mechanism he had. He just stood on that trap door. When the Germans came, they searched, they looked, went to the cellar, everywhere, and then they asked him what's upstairs. And my mother, cool as can be, says, "I don't know. When we moved in, this was closed, this was locked, we couldn't open it, and since we don't need the space, we didn't bother forcing it." And one of the Germans climbed up the ladder, tried to push it open, with my uncle standing on it. Of course, it resisted. He let go. So, there were just a multitude of situations where it was do or die. You have to keep your cool, think what would be an acceptable answer, and hope that even in cases where they would be suspicious, they wouldn't, speak up or say something. It was so. We were fortunate, as I sort of said, being in the eastern part of Poland. So we came under Nazi occupation almost 2 years later than had we been in the west. And being in the east, we were liberated almost a year earlier by the Red Army in July 1944, whereas the armistice finally didn't take place till May of 45. And things were really getting very dicey for us because my father got picked up with by a couple of blackmailers in town, and You know, they came twice to the house, and the second time there was nothing left for them of value to take, except for us. But in but in all of this, my father's bosses, those two brothers and their wives, knew that we were Jewish, because fairly soon after my father started working for them, first they were suspicious, and then my father told them, because the wife of one of the employees, who felt very neglected by the fact that my parents didn't socialize with them, started spreading rumors that my father was Jewish. And so my father appealed to his boss to do something. And so he relocated the engineer to another factory that he had in Warsaw. But before they left, his wife sent an anonymous letter to the Polish police that this company employs a Jew. Fortunately, it did not give my father's name. And so these Polish policemen come one day and speak to my father. We understand that you hire a Jew, that you employ a Jew here. So my father sent them to speak to one of the brothers. And when the brother just wasn't coming up with anybody, you know, said, no, we're sure everybody's okay. So they said, well, look, I mean, it's really very simple. Let's call everybody in here, have them drop their pants, and we'll know. And so by that time, my father kind of got his wits back in place. And he said, look, we work in 3 shifts. There's no guarantee the man you're looking for is in a day shift. He may be one of the other shifts. He'll get word that you're looking for him, and he'll run, and you'll miss your prey. Why don't you let me investigate quietly, and I'll get back to you. I'll report back to you. And they said, fine. He said, no, here's my business card. You know, call me, get in touch with me after you've had a chance to. After a few days, one of the brothers was really very nervous, because, you know, I mean, they were taking very significant risks in all of this. So he decided to go to the police station and inquire. And the 2 policemen were sitting there and said, oh, yes, the captain wants to speak to you. So now he really got very nervous. And when he walked into the captain's office, wanted to introduce himself, says, oh, I know you, remember? We used to go hunting together. They apparently, several years before, sort of lived in the same area. They were buddies, yeah. And so after a lot of socializing and having a few drinks, the captain asks and says, look, I got this letter, I had to act on it. Do you employ a Jew? Says, oh, of course not. Oh, of course not. All right. So, matter closed. So that's why I said luck played a tremendous role. But at the same time, there were some very good people who stuck their neck out for us.
Sounds like it. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go into the second round of my questions. The stuff about after that. So, how did you get to the U.S.? It's always a story.
How did I get to the U.S.? Well,
Or what happened like after,
right.
right after?
Well, you know, getting to the U.S. is like now, right? The U.S. doesn't want refugees. There was a very high quota for East Europeans. It wasn't anti-Jewish, it was East Europeans. You know, it's like now, right? But my parents wanted to certainly first get out of Poland. And France was very liberal and open. Several of the European countries were. I know Italy was quite generous in taking refugees in. France was. Anyway, we went to France. Now, getting a visa to go to France wasn't all that difficult. What was difficult is getting permission to stay in France. A visa was for a very short duration. To stay, you were caught in a vicious cycle. You had to have proof of employment to get permission to stay, but you couldn't get employment unless you had permission to stay. And of course, you have to remember that France, as all the European countries, were greatly impoverished as a result of the war. They had great unemployment, so they were not readily open to giving employment to foreigners. It was enough that they shared their scarce food with foreigners. You know. So again, my father got a job with a Jewish organization, because when the fact of the Holocaust became known, especially by the American Jewish community, who was horrified at the fact that they had done close to nothing to try to help, there was a tremendous outpouring of assistance, mainly of clothing. Because again, I mean, we all came out with virtually nothing, but whatever, you know, was on our backs. And so my father came in charge of sorting and distributing the clothing that came from the American Jewish communities. And that's how we get dressed. And so that was his employment. We got housed, again, it was a building that was owned by the Rothschild family that was given to the Jewish community to house the refugees. We weren't called refugees. We were DPs, displaced people. And I gather there's a difference. When Russia, I should say Soviet Union, consolidated its grip on the East European countries, something changed politically, in the sense that because now a displaced person is supposed to go back where you came from. But now we could claim we don't want to go back to Poland because of the prevailing political regime. And there was an organization within the United Nations called IRO, International Refugee Organization. And we became subjects of the IROs. So we gave up our Polish passports and nationality, and we became subjects of the UN. As subject of the UN, we got permission to stay in France. And so we got settled in France, and you know, for all intents and purposes, my father started a business. You know, my younger brother was born in France. We thought we'd be staying in France until the Korean War broke out. The Korean War, really, with it came a wave of fear in Europe that World War III was around the corner. Germany wasn't built up, so the common wisdom was the communists are going to be in Paris in 48 hours. And my parents, having had already 2 encounters with the comrades, didn't want to have a third one. Plus now, being subjects of the UN, because we are objecting to the political regime in Poland, then we really felt that we would be first targets for Siberia. So that in the meantime, our quota number came up for the United States. But, you know, my parents kind of neglected pursuing that because they felt settled. With the Korean War, they said our original aim was to go to the United States. That's where we belong. Let's go. So in 1952, we came to the United States. Legally.
Your siblings with you?
Excuse me?
Did you all come over?
Yeah. Yeah, we always moved as a family. For that one incident where I was separated from my parents in the Lviv ghetto and almost kind of got lost. My parents, to the horror that they might survive but lose one of their children, resolved that never again would the family separate. The fate of one would be the fate of all. So we always moved together.
So where did you guys settle in 1952?
In New York City.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's where my uncle had settled when he came over. He came over in 41. 41. So they were sort of natural that we would stay where my father's brother was.
And how long did you stay? Did you guys stay there? How many years were you in New York for?
Till I got married.
This question is, what was one of your first jobs when you got here?
My first jobs, when I got to the United States,
Uh-huh.
giving French lessons. Well, I was 14 and a half, what could I do, right? So,
And did you get enrolled in a school when you came here? Where did you go?
yes. Well, first, we came in January, mid-school year. So to finish the school year, I went to the French lycée in New York to finish the year. It's a private school, it was quite expensive, so even though they gave us a phenomenal price, it was still much more than my father could afford. So my brother, the importance of the boy, he stayed on to finish his French education, and I went off to an American high school.
And did you go to college after that?
Yes, I went to Brooklyn College, one of the 5 city colleges in New York at that time.
And what kind of a degree did you get?
Got a bachelor's in chemistry.
And next question, when did you meet your spouse?
When did I meet my spouse? I met him in 1959. 1959.
How did you guys meet?
Well, the facetious answer he likes to give, he met me in a tree. We both attended a young adult summer camp run by the 92nd Street Y in New York City. And we went on a hike, and I like to climb trees. And I was up in the tree, and he decided to take a picture of me.
Aw, that's really cute.
Do you still have that picture?
Probably someplace.
Some black and white. No, actually you were already in color on that time. Right.
It's downstairs in the closet someplace.
So then, did you guys stay in New York, or did you move around, or did you come right to Pittsburgh, or how
No,
did that happen?
we moved around. When we got married, Leon was still in medical school. So we stayed in New York for him to finish medical school. We moved to Philadelphia for his internship. We came back to New York City for his residency. Went to South Dakota for his military service.
Oh boy.
For 2 years in the Air Force. Oh, it was wonderful. Uncle Sam took us through the dull parts of the United States and put us at the
Yes.
threshold of the beautiful West.
Yeah.
Gave us a chance to see the beautiful West.
I'm the baby of a 28-year Air Force veteran, so
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
familiar with the bopping around.
Okay. Then Leon took a position in Syracuse, New York, at what was then called Upstate Medical Center. We stayed in Syracuse for 6 years, and he decided to try his hand at private practice and took us to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a minor disaster. which brought him back to academic practice in Pittsburgh.
So when did the kids pop up, in Pittsburgh or before that?
Oh, before that. The twins were born in New York City when Leon was a resident. And then the baby came in Syracuse.
So 3.
Right.
And how many grandchildren?
7.
No, not any great grandchildren
No.
yet. Did they mostly live here, or are they scattered?
A little scattered. My older son is in Kansas City, Kansas now. His twin sister is in Mount Lebanon,
Okay.
and our youngest son is in Potomac, Maryland.
Not bad.
Yeah. Nobody's on the West Coast, thankfully.
Yeah, exactly. So 2 more questions. What is your favorite thing to do now? What do you like doing during the day?
Oh, wow. I like to read. During the day. Well, when we're in Pittsburgh, I take classes. I'm part of the Osher classes at Pitt.
What kind of classes?
Literature, history, and art. When we're in Florida, it's well, there's some of that also, but it's a more outdoor, physical life. Do a lot of swimming and biking, and walking on the beach.
And final question. Would you say that your experiences during the war held you back or motivated you in your life?
The experiences gave me a tremendous amount of self-confidence. That I feel that I can meet any challenge that comes my way. Basically, Leon says, I'm a survivor. And I don't buckle down in front of challenges. So it's, what I found very, very interesting is how differently my brother, I'm talking my older brother, raised his children versus how I raised my children. Now, both my brother also married a survivor. And both of them really cuddled and protected their daughters. I said to my kids, learn how to think on your feet. You've got to learn how to live in this world. It's not a cuddly, warm, fuzzy world. And we sent them out. We encouraged them to travel. So it's, I just found that very, very interesting how drastically differently we reacted to essentially the same experiences.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Starting when you taught your son how to swim.
Very cool. Else? Oh, we need the fun part. Ryan's favorite.
Yeah, I mean, we're done, except that we'd like to take a picture with you with perhaps an old photo of yourself that you
Also
have.
her husband, because that would be really
Yeah,
cute.
that as well.